Some bands set out to start a revolution. Most start just trying to get through a gig without blowing the speakers or forgetting the second verse. Buzzcocks were no different. And yet they ended up changing music history. Twice, actually. And it all came from pretty simple beginnings. At the beginning of 1976, Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto, who were actually known as Howard Trafford and Pete McNeish back then, were inspired to form a band after reading a review of a Sex Pistols set in NME. They didn't really know what they were going to be, but they knew they were going to do something. Not long after, they drove down to London to watch the Pistols play. Something about how raw, visceral, and alive it all felt just clicked. It was music anyone could do if they just got on with it. So that's what they did. Back in Manchester, the duo started writing lyrics and music, and also changed their names to Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto. Alongside this, they were organising a very special gig. They were planning to bring Sex Pistols up to Manchester to play. Mainly for the selfish reason of having Buzzcocks support them. They didn't end up in the support slot for this gig though. And this show on the 4th of June 1976 at the Lesser Free Trade Hall in Manchester has gone on to become one of the most legendary gigs of all time. This gig is a pivotal moment in the story of UK rock. It's since been called the gig that changed the world. Books have been written about this one gig, a gig that Pete Shelley and Howard Devoto of Buzzcocks organised. Only about 40 people showed up. But from that tiny crowd, an entire era was born. As these things tend to go, some of the details have been a bit blurred or told in different ways over the years, but here are just some of the characters supposedly present at that gig. Peter Hook and Bernard Sumner of Joy Division were there. Peter Hook and most sources agree that the Pistols gig was the major inspiration to start the band. I saw the Sex Pistols on the 4th of June 1976, and as we walked out of the venue at about 11 o'clock, I said to Barney, we really should form a band, which we did on the stairs at the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. So that is when I began, back in 1976. There was also a young man who went by the name of Morrissey in that audience, who was also so inspired that he would later become the frontman of the Smiths. Mark E. Smith was there as well, and was so convinced he could do it better that he formed The Fall. In fact, that was a common theme. Dave Nolan, who wrote I Swear I Was There, the gig that changed the world, writes about the feeling among these musicians in the crowd along the lines of, that's rubbish, we could do so much better than that. And the founding members of Factory Records, the label who would sign half of these bands and define the Manchester sound, were there as well. They would start the label in 1978. So without this gig, Manchester's indie scene, Madchester as it's known, wouldn't have been the same. The Smiths, as mentioned, wouldn't have formed, Joy Division wouldn't have formed, The Fall, even Happy Mondays and Oasis. And then think about how these groups went on to inspire other bands around the country and the world, like waves of inspiration travelling outwards from this one gig. It might be a stretch, but I think you could argue that without this gig, there would be no Green Day, or Nirvana, or Suede, or Pavement, or Arctic Monkeys, or even Radiohead. And then think how many bands those bands went on to inspire. It really is incredible when you trace it all back to that one gig. All thanks to Shelley and Devoto. And they didn't even know it. But as it turns out, they weren't finished with changing the course of music history. After that Sex Pistols gig, now with a full band lineup, they were more inspired than ever. And they asked themselves an important question. What if we just make a record and don't wait for permission? And that's what Spiral Scratch is. So in December 1976, while people were still trying to figure out what punk even sounded like, Buzzcocks went into a studio to show them their take on it. They borrowed cash from friends and Pete's dad and scrounged up around 500 quid, not enough to do it properly, but they didn't care. They had 4 songs, a band, and the sense that something big was about to happen. And in proper punk style, they recorded it all in 3 hours and mixed it in another 2. Done. That was it. Spiral Scratch ended up becoming the first ever self-released English punk EP. They had no label and no industry help. The Damned had already released the single New Rose, and Sex Pistols, of course, had already released Anarchy in the UK, making those the first ever English punk releases. But they were with labels. The thing that makes Spiral Scratch so special is that it was truly DIY. It was all done by the band. They pressed 1,000 records and released it on their homemade label called New Hormones. Just 4 songs, 1 pressing plant, and a hell of a lot of grit. They didn't expect it to sell at all. They just wanted to do it. The story goes that they just hoped to sell at least half of the 1,000 to pay back Pete's dad. But then, it started picking up. In dribs and drabs, it started to take off. Virgin sold 25 copies, Rough Trade ordered 50, and then immediately ordered 200 more. And then it reached the legendary BBC Radio 1 DJ John Peel, who played it. And then it was off. All of a sudden, they were getting thousands of mail orders. It was all over the music papers. And then it had sold 16,000 copies. Safe to say, they could pay Pete's dad back. Suddenly, Spiral Scratch wasn't just a little EP anymore. It was proof. Proof that you didn't need a record deal to make a record. You didn't need a producer and a board of people telling you what would sell and what wouldn't. You just needed songs, nerve, and a bit of DIY spirit. And this is how they changed music history for a second time. They demystified the process of making albums. Everyone was doing it after this. Bands were creating their own indie labels, recording and releasing their own albums and singles. It was a revolution, and it just snowballed from there. The producer on Spiral Scratch, Martin Hannett, credited as Martin Zero on the record, went on to become synonymous with Joy Division, guiding them through some of their greatest hits. And again, when they became New Order, he also helped found Factory Records, who represented countless indie bands through the 70s and 80s. It was an institution. And all of this is like a big spiderweb of legacy, with Spiral Scratch and Buzzcocks at the centre. It's really hard to overstate the significance of those 4 tracks, and the songs themselves perfectly reflect the just get in and do it mentality. The whole EP is over in about 9 minutes and 20 seconds. There's absolutely no polish, it's gloriously rough, and that's the whole point. Buzzcocks were poised to be the next big thing in punk, and ride a wave they created. But then, just like that, Devoto left. Spiral Scratch came out in January 1977, and after just 11 gigs, Howard left. So he left to form Magazine, which is often referred to as one of the first post-punk bands. Pete Shelley stepped up as frontman, and Buzzcocks didn't really miss a beat. If anything, they got sharper, more melodic, but that's another story. What Spiral Scratch left behind was bigger than Buzzcocks themselves. It redefined what a band could do. Until then, you either got signed or you didn't exist. You waited for someone to discover you, trying to convince a label that you were worth it. Spiral Scratch changed that. And for decades, all the best indie and punk bands carried a bit of that Buzzcocks DNA. That sense of, we'll do it our way. Spiral Scratch is a tiny, scrappy EP that told an entire generation, no one's gonna do it for you, so just do it yourself. It just shows what can happen if you're stupid enough to believe that you can do something. History is made by those who turn up. Now, I mentioned New Order in this video. Did you know that their single Blue Monday actually lost money with every copy sold, despite being one of the best-selling singles of all time? It's a fascinating story. You can click over there for that one next.